The day a president chose silence over power. There are moments when the most powerful voice in the nation says nothing, not because it can't speak, but because it chooses not to. And sometimes that silence changes history more than any speech ever could. This story begins during a crisis that unfolded slowly enough to be ignored, but loudly enough to demand attention. The warning signs were everywhere. Institutions strained, public trust weakened, pressure mounted behind closed doors. None of it exploded at once. Instead, it accumulated day after day, creating a tension that felt manageable right up until it wasn't. And yet, from the highest office in the land, the response was restraint rather than direction. To understand why this silence mattered, we have to step into the mindset of the presidency at that moment. Power was available. Authority was unquestioned. Legal standing was intact. A single statement could have altered the direction of events. A single action could have drawn a boundary that no one would cross. The office still carried weight, credibility, and influence. This was not a presidency stripped of tools. But the decision wasn't made. The president believed that speaking would inflame tensions, that intervention would worsen division, that restraint might preserve stability. Silence felt like maturity, like discipline, like the responsible choice in an environment already charged with emotion. It was framed as patience rather than avoidance, prudence rather than fear. What went unseen was how silence is interpreted when fear already exists. To some, it signaled weakness. To others, it looked like approval. And to those waiting for direction, it created a vacuum. In moments of uncertainty, people do not wait for clarity forever. They fill the gap themselves, often with assumptions far more extreme than reality. Silence doesn't pause events. It redirects them. As days passed, uncertainty spread faster than clarity ever could. Rumors replaced facts. Speculation outran confirmation. Extremes filled the space where leadership should have stood. And the longer the White House remained quiet, the more authority slipped away. Not because it was revoked, but because it was no longer exercised. This wasn't a failure of power. It was a decision not to use it. And once that choice was made, history began moving without permission. Inside the administration, debate was relentless. Advisors argued over timing, tone, and consequence. Some warned that silence would be remembered as abandonment. Others insisted that intervention would ignite something far worse. Every option carried risk. Every word felt dangerous. No one doubted the stakes. The disagreement was about which risk was survivable. The president listened and waited. What made this moment unique wasn't uncertainty. It was authority. The legal power to act was clear. The public mandate was still intact. Yet hesitation hardened into policy. Statements were drafted, revised, and shelved. Decisions were postponed in favor of observation. Waiting became strategy, even as conditions deteriorated. Outside the White House, interpretation replaced intention. Silence became a signal, even if it was never meant to be. Opponents grew bolder. Allies grew confused. Neutral voices began choosing sides, not because they wanted to, but because no guidance arrived to anchor them. Power thrives on clarity. When clarity disappears, influence fractures. The crisis expanded beyond its original scope. What started as a contained problem spread across institutions, jurisdictions, and public trust. Each hour without direction increased the cost of eventual action. By the time responses were considered, they were no longer preventative. They were reactive. The presidency was no longer shaping outcomes. It was managing fallout. There was a moment, brief and fragile, when intervention could still have reverse momentum. But that moment required decisiveness, not deliberation. It required accepting short-term backlash to preserve long-term authority. And by the time the silence broke, the narrative was already being written by others. History would later debate whether action would have worked, but it would never debate this. Silence didn't prevent escalation. It accelerated it. By the time the president finally spoke, the moment had already changed. The words were measured, careful, reasonable, but they arrived in a landscape that no longer responded to moderation. What should have been guidance sounded like reaction. What should have been leadership felt late. Authority, once unquestioned, now had compete. Compete with louder voices, faster narratives, stronger emotions. Control had not vanished, but it had diluted. Influence was no longer centralized. The crisis evolved. It no longer revolved around the original issue. It revolved around trust. And trust, once fractured, is nearly impossible to restore with language alone. Inside the administration, urgency replaced debate. Emergency plans were drafted. Legal options reconsidered. But every action now carried amplified consequences. Any use of power risked backlash. Any restraint risked collapse. The space for clean solutions had vanished. This is the hidden cost of hesitation. Not that it creates danger, but that it removes good options. Leadership becomes a series of compromises with damage already done. Public perception hardened. Supporters felt betrayed. Critics felt justified. Undecided voices, the ones that often determine outcomes, stopped listening altogether. Confidence eroded not because the presidency lacked authority, but because authority arrived too late to matter. The presidency was still powerful on paper, but power is not just authority. It's timing, and timing had been lost. History often remembers this phase as confusion, but inside it, the reality was simpler. The silence had already decided the direction. Everything that followed was momentum rather than choice. The consequences unfolded quietly at first. No single moment marked collapse. No dramatic announcement declared failure. Instead, authority eroded in fragments. One ignored directive, one defied expectation, one lost opportunity at a time. What made this presidency unforgettable wasn't the crisis itself. It was a realization that power and use doesn't remain neutral. It reshapes the future without consent. Silence, once chosen, becomes precedent, and precedents outlive presidencies. In the aftermath, historians would debate alternatives. Some argued that intervention would have worsened everything. Others insisted it was the last chance to preserve order. But those debates all shared one flawed assumption, that the moment still existed. It didn't. The true turning point wasn't when events spiraled. It was when leadership hesitated while momentum was still fragile, when clarity could have contained chaos, when direction could have anchored trust. Instead, the presidency became a symbol of restraint in a moment that demanded resolve. And that is why this day still matters. Because every generation faces its own version of this choice. Use authority early, imperfectly, boldly, visibly, or preserve calm until calm no longer exists. History doesn't punish silence immediately. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it is rarely forgiving. The day